Hi, friends. This is Ken. I'm checking in, and I wanted to talk to you for a few minutes about the world reopening. This is different from many of the other topics that we've discussed of late, but I do want to talk about this briefly because I've gotten quite a few messages from people saying, "What is God showing me about the near term and when are things going to reopen and all that?" I don't know that I can tell you with certainty when the world is going to reopen. Um, some people are, you know, seeking to do that. Maybe they have a higher prophetic gift than I do. I don't know. But here's what I can tell you. I can tell you how the world will reopen when it reopens. And maybe that's even more valuable than knowing exactly when because you can start looking for the leading indicators. So, when I talk about how is the world going to reopen, you need to understand something about social systems. And by that, I mean larger organizations. For a lot of people, all they've ever done is work in a small company with a handful of people, or maybe they've never worked outside the home, they've been raising kids, or they work on a farm or something like that. Well, for people like this, it's difficult to appreciate the way large human social systems work. So let's talk about that before we do anything further. And when we talk about that, usually in any social system, there are the leaders and there are the followers. Just think about when you were in high school or maybe college. There were those kids or young adults who were the thought leaders, and kind of what they did was what most people did. There's always the outliers who buck the trend and say, no, not going along with it. But those thought leaders kind of galvanize everyone else. When I think of the United States and its government, and I think particularly of the U.S. Senate, we have 100 senators in our Senate, and effectively, there's probably 13 people who control 90% or more of what goes on in the U.S. Senate. The rest of them are followers, and while they have an equal vote with those thought leaders, they generally don't set the pace. They're not the lead dog on the sled, as they say up in Alaska. So every social system functions this way. And right now, most of the world is closed, and there's 5 billion people or more on this planet who are shut in. If you're watching this, you're probably one of them because it means that you at least have an internet connection. And the people who are not shut in are probably people who live in remote areas of the desert or the jungle. They may be tribal, they may be animist in religious view, but they are not really hooked up to what we call modernity in a huge way. They may be completely disconnected from modernity, or they may have a passing or marginal connection to it, but that's it. Okay, so in a large social system, and when you're talking about the whole world, by definition, you've got a large social system. You'll have your thought leaders and your followers. And I know this is going to offend some people. Please don't be offended. I'm not trying to offend you. I'm just describing the way the world really works. The thought leaders in the world tend to be the countries that we call the G10 or maybe the G20 countries. These are the 20 largest economies in the world, and they collectively control most of the goods and services and economic output. They may not have all the people, but they have all the power. And most of them are also somewhere in there the most militarily advanced and sophisticated. So if they want to throw their weight around, they can. Who's on the G20 list? Well, you could look it up on Google, and I don't need to tell you, but they would be names you would expect. The United States is for sure on that list. Great Britain is on that list. And maybe we could say the whole of the United Kingdom, but it's really England that we're talking about, even more than Scotland or Ireland. Or Wales. So again, if you live in the UK, please don't be offended. I'm just a realist. I'm just describing what is. I'm always deal in reality. Germany's on that list. Italy's on that list. France, Spain, maybe not Spain actually, but anyway, because I didn't check it before I did this broadcast. But you could just Google the term G20 countries and you will find them. China is for sure on that list. Now here's the way it works. In large organizations like this, that we call the world, when you have a big problem to manage, you're going to have daily calls to deal with the problem, whatever the problem is. And those people are all talking to each other regularly. And so the heads of public health in all of these countries are talking to all the other heads of public health in these countries. And it's not just the daily conference call, it's that throughout the day they're sending text messages or sending emails or maybe picking up the phone and having a quick live conversation, maybe not with the whole decision making set, maybe with two or three at a time, but there's a collaborative and iterative process that goes on. So Japan, by the way, would also be on that list. And so, that process has been ongoing. And I guarantee you, every day there is a conference call where these people are talking to each other. And by the way, it's not just the heads of public health. It might well be the heads of state who are talking with each other also. And so when these heads of state are collaborating, they may actually come into the call with the public health people, and they all sit in one big room together and have a big Zoom conference. Or maybe the heads of state talk among themselves, and then they decide what they want. They kind of lean on their public health people. Or maybe the public health people say, our heads of state are totally clueless. We need to circulate information up to them. This is commonly known in the business of large organizational management as managing upward. That's what they're doing. They're managing upward to the boss. And this is going on. I guarantee you, I would bet $1,000 right now this is going on regularly and iteratively across the world. And when people go to bed at night, okay, they shut off for a few hours. Last messages are, whether by email or text or whatever. And when they wake up in the morning, they have responses from their colleagues across the world who were awake while they were asleep. And so this is what's going on. Now, right now in the United States, right now, today, at this moment, as I'm making this video, the state of Oklahoma has announced that it's going to reopen for business on the 1st of May. Well, today is the 22nd of April, so that's 8 days away. In 1 week and a bit, Oklahoma is going to reopen for business. Now, in the scheme of things, and please no one in Oklahoma be offended, I'm not trying to insult you, I'm talking about how do social systems work. Right now, Oklahoma does not have very many cases of COVID, and their governor has made a decision that the risk economically of remaining closed is bigger than the risk of infection spreading throughout the state. And so he's making what we would call a calculated risk. He knows that there is a risk that this thing will spiral out of control and COVID will go ballistic, and maybe in the end he'll have to shut the state down again. He knows this. But he's taking into account that they've had, like 150 deaths or thereabouts, which in the scheme of things is not a huge number. He's looking at the total number of COVID deaths across the whole of the U.S. and saying this is less than we had in the U.S. from regular flu last year. Apparently, this COVID thing is much ado about nothing. Now, I don't know if he would actually use that language. I don't want to put words in his mouth. I'm just saying it's that sort of thought process that goes on. And so with that, he's made a decision. He's going to reopen his state. And there are some other states in the U.S. that also have a low incidence of infection. Wyoming, Utah, Kansas, Nebraska, both of the Dakotas. Now, these are generally less populated areas, but population dynamics and the risk of infection is what it is. But once Oklahoma reopens, and knowing that it's coming, I guarantee you the pressure's already on. All the states that I named, and probably a bunch of others besides, their people are going to be saying, hey, we want to go back to work too. And how come we can't go back to work? We're losing our homes, we're losing our jobs, we're draining our life savings, and on it goes. And so they're picking up the phone, they're calling their state representatives, they're calling their congressmen, they're calling their senators, they're calling whoever they can, they're sending emails, however they're communicating, there's a political back pressure that starts to build, all because somebody broke ranks. That's what Oklahoma has done. And pretty soon there's a groundswell. And if you're watching the news, you know that there have been protests. We had some here in Southern California. Florida had a bunch of them. And people are saying, we want to be let out of jail. We want to be free. And somebody had posted a sign. I think this one was it's either New York or England. I've seen so many videos that people are sending me that I can't even keep track of where they're all coming from. But one of these signs said, perfect security without being able to leave is called a prison. And so, this was being held up in a park. And I saw protests in Germany, and this one was clearly Germany because I remember them speaking German. And police are in riot gear, and they're arresting grandmothers because they're out on the street, and they're not supposed to be, and you need to get inside. We got to keep this thing under control. So all of that back pressure is going on. Now, keep in mind, at least in the United States of America, this is an election year, which means in November, everybody's going to the poll. That's 7 months from now. And if you're Joe Blow and you're living in, I'll say, Illinois, and you see that next door in Iowa, people were allowed to go back to work, but you couldn't, and your car got repossessed, or your savings got drained, or you lost your job, or whatever, do you think you're going to vote for your governor to be returned to office? Do you think you're going to be voting? And there'll be a knock-on effect. Lots of senators and congressmen, they'll be voted out of office because they'll be like, throw them all out. They're all a bunch of rascals and ratbags, and they ruined our lives. That'll be what people are saying. So just because Oklahoma has broken ranks, and with it the other states that have sort of comparable dynamics, there's going to be pressure building politically for other states that are probably a lot more infected and a lot more at risk to do the same. This will include states like California, Washington State, New York, Florida, Washington, D.C. area, which would be both Virginia and Maryland. Texas, all these states, and Texas is adjacent to Oklahoma. So all these states will be feeling that pressure, and their people will be saying, hey, we want to go back to work too. Hey, let us out. And politicians, they always want to hang on to their job too, just like you do. And so they're going to be balancing that. Well, do we keep it locked down for fear of the public health issues? And Fauci's going to be saying, no, not yet, because he's talking to all his public health buddies in all the other parts of the world. That'll be going on the one hand, and on the other hand, the politicians will be saying, we need to open the country. We're going to get voted out of office. And by the way, Donald Trump is also somewhere in all this doing the same sort of thing, because he has to stand for re-election this year. Whether you like Trump or hate him, this is a reality. And so all of this political back pressure is building, and with it, it's not, by the way, confined, in my example, to the United States. This will also Europe, and there will be states within Germany or France where the incidence is lower, and they'll be doing exactly what I just described in the United States, except it'll be in Germany or France or England. And so the pressure will be mounting in those countries. And sooner or later, someone's going to break ranks, and a thought leader type country, and I don't know who it'll be, could be the U.S., could be Germany. They have a very low incidence of death and infection. They've managed it very well. But somebody somewhere is going to say, yep, we're in. We're opening up for business. And there'll be the usual catcalls and cries for, beheadings of those who are disregarding the public health, and on it'll go, because there'll be a lot of drama. And, they're already saying it about Trump, right? He doesn't care if people die. He just wants money. Well, they'll be saying that in Europe. But this is the balance that's going on. And so eventually someone will break ranks, and with that, others will effectively be forced to go along with that, because the outcry will be such that at the ground level, people are saying, we want out, we want to go back to work, let our people go. And so suddenly you have a pivoting of the world opinion. And don't think for a minute this can't happen. It happens all the time. Back in January, people were mocking the idea that this COVID was the Wu flu, or that it came out of maybe a research lab in China. Maybe not deliberately, maybe it was an accident. But now very credible news channels like the Washington Post, the New York Times are rethinking all this, and they are talking about exactly the possibility that all this happened because China was not careful in the way they managed this crisis when it first erupted. And they said it was coming out of a wet market in Wuhan, but actually there's a fair amount of evidence that's gathering within the intelligence community that just maybe this did come out of a research lab, and whether it was an accidental or deliberate release, it happened. By the way, in brackets, I just want to say, I made a comment on one of the Facebook Lives a couple weeks ago about how I didn't believe that Nancy Pelosi had gone to China and collaborated with the Chinese. I still believe that. I'm just saying that there appears to be a growing body of evidence that this may have actually come out of a research lab in China. That wasn't a wet market, it wasn't some random thing, that the Chinese were cultivating this coronavirus and something happened, whatever that something was. And at this point, it doesn't matter if it was accidental or deliberate. The point is it came out of China. And that's not a racist comment. It's just a data point. It's a fact. Okay, so back out of the brackets now. So suddenly you've got this groundswell of sentiment, of opinion to reopen. And it's going to be a pivot. It'll happen in a matter of 2 or 3 days that the whole world opinion will change. And as I said, credible news sources in my country, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they are the Wall Street Journal, they are actually running articles and talking openly about the possibility that this came out of a research lab in China, whereas in January everybody was poo-pooing it. In fact, Nancy Pelosi, our Speaker of the House of Representatives, had said that it was a racist thing that Donald Trump was wanting to ban travel from China. In retrospect, with this news out in the open, maybe Trump wasn't so stupid after all. And although he was painted as a racist, maybe he was actually acting in the interests of national security and good public health. Not that he's against Chinese people per se. If it had happened in, I don't know, South Africa, he would have banned South Africans. But anyway, it came out of China, so he was dealing with the Chinese problem. I think that's the way to think about this. And so what will happen is, as all of this is kind of swirling and coming up, the world will suddenly make a pivot, whereas, they were saying be closed, no one goes out, no public gathering. Suddenly the thing will break, and there will be many people who will suddenly be saying, yeah, we do need to reopen. And I mean literally in a matter of 2 or 3 days, the whole world will change. Suddenly airlines will be booking flights. Suddenly countries that had 2-week quarantines will lift them. Maybe they won't lift the quarantine, but they'll let flights arrive again, which they haven't been doing. Or beaches will reopen. They'll say, well, we'll let people walk on the beaches again. I mean, there are many forms this could take, but things that were unthinkable 48, 72 hours previously will suddenly be, yep, game on, let's get going, let's get the world back to work, we got to get back to normal, and it'll be on. Now, that doesn't mean everything will happen at once. There may be some places where it'll be quicker than others. For example, go back to my example. Maybe Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, maybe states like that will relatively open pretty quickly. But maybe states like Texas will be slower, but not as slow as, say, California or New York. And so with that, Texas may say, we're going to lift our border quarantines and we'll let these kinds of businesses go back to work, but these others that we deem to be less essential, let's just watch those a little longer before we let them go back to work. There is this kind of staged possibility, but the point is everything's moving in a direction. And as people are trying it, as they're putting their toe in the water, what they'll find is that, well, it's either not working and there's a sudden explosion of infection, or it is working and we can relax even more, and I might say even more rapidly. So there'll be almost what we call a second order effect or an exponential effect, whereas we start to let people out and we start to go like that, and all of a sudden it just takes off. That's how the world is going to reopen. When it reopens, I don't know, but I will say this. May the 1st, Oklahoma is reopening for business. That will be a catalyst. Other states like Oklahoma will probably be close behind it or maybe on the same day.